We're shifting our focus now to look at the world's most infamous nuclear accidents and the deep-seated fears they've left behind. When the Chernobyl reactor exploded in 1986 due to a flawed design and disabled safety systems, it became the worst commercial nuclear disaster in history. It's definitely the one everyone thinks of when they worry about nuclear power. But exactly how deadly was that initial explosion? Out of the 600 workers present, 134 received massive doses of radiation, resulting in 28 deaths within 3 months and another 19 over the next couple of decades. But remarkably, among first responders, there's been no increase in solid cancers, just a slight bump in leukemia. That's tragic, but honestly much lower than I expected. What about the fallout that spread over the surrounding towns and countries? The main public health impact actually came from radioactive ash settling on Ukrainian grazing land, which dairy cows then concentrated into their milk. Because children drank that milk, their small thyroids absorbed high doses, leading to 6,000 cases of thyroid cancer and 15 deaths so far. Couldn't they have just thrown the milk away for a few weeks until the radiation faded? Exactly. And Britain actually did just that after a 1957 reactor fire, completely avoiding harm because radioactive iodine has a half-life of only 8 days. Even with that failure in Ukraine, Chernobyl has caused only hundreds of early deaths, and it remains the only commercial nuclear accident to ever kill people with radiation. Wait, are you saying Fukushima and 3 Mile Island didn't kill anyone with radiation? That's right. Neither saw a single responder die from direct radiation, yet the panic and mass evacuations likely caused more harm than the background radiation would have. Contrast this with the 1984 Bhopal chemical leak or the 1975 Banjiao Dam collapse in China, which killed tens of thousands instantly, but barely register in public memory. If non-nuclear disasters are so much deadlier, why is nuclear power treated like an existential threat? It comes down to a global regulatory regime built on the unconvincing claim that even tiny, spread-out doses of radiation are completely intolerable. By treating every minor release as a catastrophe, we've driven up costs and sidelined one of our most powerful technologies over an unsupported fear.
We are going to look at an extraordinary real-world case of long-term radiation exposure that started in the early 1980s. Between 1982 and 1984, over 180 buildings in Taiwan were constructed using recycled steel unknowingly contaminated with cobalt-60.
Cobalt-60 sounds familiar. Isn't that highly radioactive and dangerous?
It is, because it emits deeply penetrating gamma rays that can be fatal in large acute doses. But here, over 10,000 people lived in these buildings for 2 decades, receiving an average dose about 7 times higher than normal background radiation.
Did everyone in those buildings get the exact same amount of exposure?
No, it varied wildly depending on where people spent their time in the apartments. Some spots gave off less than a single CT scan of radiation per year, while others emitted the equivalent of 2 CT scans every single day.
That sounds terrifying. So did researchers find a massive spike in cancer rates among the residents?
Surprisingly, early studies found that cancer rates were dramatically lower than the general population. The lead researcher claimed this proved a theory called hormesis, where low doses of a stressor, like radiation, improve health by triggering the body's repair systems.
Kind of like how exercise stresses the cardiovascular system to build it back stronger.
Exactly. But the broader scientific community completely rejected this conclusion because the study failed to control for age. The residents in those buildings happened to be far younger than the average Taiwanese population.
Oh, and since younger people naturally develop cancer much less frequently, the lower cancer rates were likely just due to their age.
You nailed it. That is why the Environmental Protection Agency warns that this specific data suffers from major statistical shortcomings and should not be used to claim radiation has health benefits.
We are turning our attention to how scientists have analyzed the health effects of low-dose radiation exposure in Taiwan. After earlier data issues, later studies finally matched accurate radiation dose estimates with people's actual health outcomes and ages.
Did those improved studies give us a clearer picture of whether that low-dose radiation actually causes cancer?
They claimed to find a link, but reaching that conclusion required some serious statistical manipulation. For instance, a 2006 study of over 7,000 exposed people reported slightly elevated rates of thyroid cancer in women and leukemia in men.
That sounds like a real link, so what was wrong with their math?
The big red flag is that the overall cancer rate for this exposed group was actually lower than the general Taiwanese population, even controlling for age. To find those specific increases, the researchers sliced the data into 77 tiny subcategories, like tongue cancer in men.
So if you divide the data into 77 different buckets, aren't you bound to find a spike in at least one of them just by chance?
Exactly. And that is the first major problem. Across 77 statistical tests, basic probability says you would expect to see about 4 significant results purely from random variation. Plus, every single cancer spike they highlighted relied on just 7 or fewer actual observed cases.
That is an incredibly small number of cases to base a sweeping conclusion on.
It is. And to make matters worse, the authors didn't register their hypotheses in advance. That means we have no idea if they sliced the data into hundreds of different tests and just cherry-picked the few that happened to show a correlation.
So despite them highlighting those few specific cancers, the big picture is still that the exposed group didn't get more cancer overall?
Right. And that is the biggest flaw in their claim. The total number of cancer cases observed in the exposed population was substantially lower than expected, which directly contradicts the idea that this low-level radiation was causing harm. We're turning our attention to how scientists later reevaluated the health data from people living in irradiated buildings in Taiwan. A 2017 study followed up on about 6,000 exposed residents with 10 additional years of data to see if low-dose radiation actually caused illness.
Did they find any strong connections with that extra decade of information?
They did claim to find an 11% increase in female breast cancer, but just like earlier research on this group, the data is incredibly brittle. The researchers essentially ran dozens of tests without stating their hypotheses beforehand, making it highly likely they just stumbled across a few random correlations.
So they were basically cherry-picking the specific cancers that happened to go up.
Exactly. And they failed to highlight a massive contradiction. The overall cancer rate in this irradiated group was actually about 35% lower than the general Taiwanese population. If being exposed to that much radiation correlates with a huge drop in overall cancers, those tiny isolated spikes in specific diseases are probably just statistical noise.
Wait, 35% lower overall? How did the researchers try to explain away that massive drop?
They argued it was simply because the residents lived in newly constructed buildings, assuming they had a higher socioeconomic status and better overall health. But that doesn't hold up, primarily because some of those buildings were actually public housing meant for much poorer residents.
Even if they were all wealthy, would that really account for a 35% difference in cancer rates?
Not at all, since for context, doctors in Taiwan only have about a 10% lower cancer incidence than the general public. None of the standard socioeconomic variations come anywhere close to explaining a 35% gap.
Does that mean the radiation was actually beneficial and prevented cancer?
Some overly enthusiastic nuclear power fans have actually tried to claim that. But realistically, considering the highly flawed methodology, these results are most likely evidence of absolutely nothing. Let's look at why it's so incredibly difficult for scientists to measure the health effects of very low doses of radiation. Since 2011, science has been reckoning with the replication crisis, where many famous, eye-catching findings actually turned out to be statistical illusions.
Are you saying the studies linking low-level radiation to cancer might be part of that crisis?
Exactly, because researchers sometimes use a statistical trick called p-hacking, which means slicing data into tiny subgroups until they find a random correlation by pure chance. Detecting a real tiny effect from low-dose radiation requires massive studies because natural cancer rates and lifestyle factors create so much background noise.
So what happens when they actually do a massive, well-designed study on radiation exposure?
The most serious attempt is the in-work study of 300,000 nuclear workers, which found that an extra 100 millisieverts of radiation, about 10 full-body CT scans, adds roughly 1% to your lifetime risk of cancer death. For context, the median worker in that study only received a 4 millisievert dose.
1% seems incredibly small, especially compared to everyday risks.
It is. Especially when you consider that eating 50 grams of processed meat every day raises your risk by 18%.
Plus, that 1% finding in inworks is fragile because it ignores the natural background radiation we all absorb just by living on Earth.
Does the data hold up if they look at workers with different exposure levels?
Not really, because that tiny statistical effect only appears within a very specific narrow dose range between 20 and 50 millisieverts and disappears outside of that.
What about extreme historical cases, like those women who painted glow-in-the-dark watch dials with radium?
The workers who were told to lick their paintbrushes absorbed massive acute doses internally and tragically suffered horrific bone cancers. But the thousands of painters who didn't lick their brushes received doses hundreds of times higher than normal without seeing any increased cancer rates.
So unless you're absorbing a massive acute dose all at once, the danger is essentially negligible?
Exactly. When scientists look this hard for harm from low-level cumulative radiation and find such weak signals, that absence of evidence is actually pretty solid evidence of absence.